Hi friends, welcome to Anshu's library. Today I am going to discuss about carbohydrates. In this class I am going to discuss about general properties of carbohydrates, physical properties and biological importance of carbohydrates. Okay, let's start the class. First of all, going to definition. Carbohydrate is a group of organic compounds occurring in living tissues and foods in the form of starch, cellulose and sugars. We know that carbohydrates are organic compounds. They are present in living tissues in the form of starch, in the form of cellulose and sugars. And the ratio of oxygen and hydrogen in carbohydrates is the same as in water, that is 2 is to 1. The same ratio the same ratio present in carbohydrates. And the other definition is carbohydrates are polyhydroxy aldehydes or ketones or substances that yield such compounds on hydrolysis which yield the compounds polyhydroxyaldehydes or ketones. The empirical formula we know that CH2ON. There are mainly three classes of carbohydrates: monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. So, monosaccharides, we know that mono means single, saccharide means sugar unit. So, monosaccharides, which consisting of single sugar unit. These are simple sugars, consist of a single polyhydroxyaldehyde or ketone unit. The most abundant monosaccharide in nature is 6 carbon sugar D-glucose. The most abundant monosaccharide is D-glucose, sometimes referred as dextrose. Very important and the competitive exams ki D-glucose, dextrose. And coming to the next class, that is oligosaccharides or oligosaccharides, consist of short chains of monosaccharides. Monosaccharide units or residues joined by glycosidic bonds. So these oligosaccharides consist of 2 to 10 monosaccharide units. They are joined by glycosidic bonds. The most abundant are the disaccharides with 2 monosaccharide units. Disaccharides consist of di means 2. 2 monosaccharide units. The best example sucrose or maltose or lactose. For disaccharides, these are examples for disaccharides which contain 2 monosaccharide units. And coming to polysaccharides, the polysaccharides are sugar polymers containing more than 10 or so monosaccharide units and sometimes have hundreds or thousands of units. The best example starch. Polysaccharides means whatever more than 10 sugar monosaccharide to 10 monosaccharide units. Polysaccharides again they are of two types based on their function and composition. They are of two types: storage polysaccharides, example starch, and the next one structural polysaccharides, example cellulose. So these are three classes of carbohydrates: monosaccharides, oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. So in coming classes I am going to discuss in detail. Now I am going to discuss about, just look at this flow chart before going to the general properties of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates mainly these are four classes: monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. Monosaccharide means one sugar molecules which consist of one sugar molecule. Best example glucose, fructose, galactose. Disaccharides two sugar molecules: sucrose, lactose, maltose. Oligosaccharides 2 to 10 sugar molecules: raffinose, stachyose. Polysaccharides more than 10 sugar molecules: starch, glycogen, cellulose. So these are few examples of carbohydrates. Now I am going to discuss about general properties of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates act as energy reserves, also stores metabolic intermediate. So these carbohydrates act as energy reserves. They also stores metabolic intermediates. And the next general property, ribose and deoxyribose sugars forms the structural frame of the genetic material, that is DNA and RNA. Ribose and deoxyribose sugars. These two sugars forms the structural frame of the genetical material, that is RNA and DNA. We know that ribonucleic acid and deoxyribonucleic acid. And the next point, polysaccharides like cellulose are the structural element in the cell walls of bacteria and plants. We know that bacteria and plants which consist of polysaccharides like cellulose. So polysaccharide like cellulose which forms a structural, which is a structural element in cell walls of bacteria and plants. And coming to next, carbohydrates are linked to proteins and lipids that play important role in cell interactions. So for cell interactions, these carbohydrates are linked to proteins and lipids, and they play a very important role in cell interactions. And coming to biological importance, carbohydrates are chief energy sources in many animals. They are instant source of energy. We know that carbohydrates are chief energy reserves, and glucose is broken down by glycolysis, Krebs cycle, to yield ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We know that glucose is broken down by glycolysis. In coming classes, I am going to discuss about glycolysis, Krebs cycles. So, and the next biological importance is glucose is the source of storage of energy. It is stored as glycogen in animals. We know that in animals the glucose is stored in the form of glycogen, and in plants starch. The glucose is stored in the form of starch. We know that stored carbohydrates act as energy sources. Instead of proteins, the stored carbohydrates act as energy sources. And coming to carbohydrates or intermediates in biosynthesis of fats and proteins. So in the process of biosynthesis of fats and proteins, these carbohydrates act as metabolic intermediates. And the next importance is carbohydrates aid in regulation of nervous tissue and is the energy source for brain. So these carbohydrates support the regulation of nerve tissue, and they are also energy source for brain. Carbohydrates get associated with lipids and proteins. They form store surface antigens, receptor molecules, vitamins and antibiotics. These carbohydrates, whenever they are associated with lipids and proteins, they form antibiotics, vitamins, surface antigens and receptor molecules. In animals, they are important constituent of connective tissues, and they participate in biological transport, cell to cell communication and activation of growth factors. So this is also one of the important biological property. Carbohydrates that are rich in fiber content. We know that carbohydrates are rich in fiber content help to prevent constipation. We know that also they help in modulation of immune system. So these are a few biological properties of carbohydrates, biological importance. And coming to physical properties of carbohydrates, the first property is stereoisomers. Stereoisomers are isomers that have the same composition but that differ in the orientation of those parts in space. There are two kinds of stereoisomers. It means the composition is same but they differ in orientation. The best example, there are two types, enantiomers and diastereomers. Coming to enantiomers, that is optical activity. Enantiomers I can explain through optical activity. సో ఇక్కడ ఏమవుతుందండి, డి గ్లూకోజ్ అండ్ ఎల్ గ్లూకోజ్, the composition is same, C6H12O6, but they vary in orientation of those parts in space. సో అరేంజ్మెంట్లో ఓరియంటేషన్లో కనుక వేరియేషన్ ఉంటే such type is called as such type of isomers or stereoisomers. So coming to optical activity, D-glucose is formed when glucose rotates the plane polarized light in the right direction. In the right direction, just remember D-glucose, dextrorotation means when glucose rotate the plane polarized light in the right direction. And coming to L-glucose is formed when glucose rotate the plane polarized light in the left direction. Just ఒక హింట్ కింద గుర్తుంచుకోండి, L represents left direction, levo rotation. The D-glucose and L-glucose is superimposable mirror images of each other. So these are enantiomers. D-glucose, L-glucose are enantiomers, superimposable mirror images. They show optical activity, dextrorotation and levo-rotation. And coming to the next property, diastereomers are defined as compounds which have the same molecular formula and sequence of bonded elements, but which are non-superimposable, non-mirror images. So they have same formula and same sequence of arrangement, but they are non-mirror images or non-superimposable images. So the best example, D-glucose and D-aldroses. D-glucose and D-aldroses having same molecular formula and sequence of bonded elements, but they are non-mirror images. So these are diastereomers. And coming to anomerism, anomers are cyclic monosaccharides that are epimers, differing from each other in the configuration of C1 if they are aldoses. కాన్ఫిగరేషన్ కనుక C1 దగ్గర డిఫర్ అయితే కనుక those are aldoses. We know that C1 కాంపౌండ్ దగ్గర కనుక aldose గ్రూప్ కనుక అటాచ్ అయి ఉంటే సో వాటిని aldoses అంటాము. ఇన్ ద కాన్ఫిగరేషన్ అట్ C2 దగ్గర కీటోన్ గ్రూప్ ఉంటే కనుక కీటోసెస్ అంటాము. సో ద ఎపిమెరిక్ కార్బన్ in anomers are known as anomeric carbon or anomeric center. So that is about anomerism. So these are few physical properties of carbohydrates. So this is just an introduction class to carbohydrates. In coming classes, I will explain in detail about monosaccharides, oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. I hope you understand this class. Thank you. మీకు వీడియో నచ్చినట్లయితే లైక్ చేయండి, షేర్ చేయండి, and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.